Hello again. In this video, we'll learn the basics of speech act theory. Now, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is language and what do we do with it? Now, when we learn the language, we are taught to produce sentences such as this is a table or I have a dog and so on and so forth. However, we need to take into account that we don't speak or write to produce correct sentences. We do so because we want to communicate our intentions and to carry out speech acts. In other words, to change the world via the language. Thus, to understand speech act theory, we need to start by defining pragmatics. Pragmatics is the study of how language is used in communication. It is obviously especially concerned with how meaning is conveyed by a speaker or writer and with how that language is then interpreted by the listener or reader. In other words, it deals more with what people mean by the utterances than what the words, phrases, or sentences mean by themselves. Therefore, every time that we speak, we do things using the language. In other words, when we say something, there are three main acts that are performed. First is the locutionary act, the illocutionary act, and the perlocutionary act. Now, when we say something, a locutionary act is produced. In other words, we say something and that is called a sentence. Secondly, because we produce this sentence in a specific context, addressing a specific interlocutor, this becomes an illocutionary act. And that's what we mean by the thing that we say, and obviously we call that an utterance. Now finally, the person that we address our utterance to, in other words, our interlocutor, is going to react in a specific way. And we call that the perlocutionary act. And that's what you get, the response or reaction from your interlocutor. Now let's look at one specific example. Imagine that a boy says to a girl, "What are you doing this weekend?" This is an illocutionary act, but then the girl is going to interpret this as obviously an invitation to do something together, like going out. So the illocutionary act, or what the boy means by "what are you doing this weekend" is, "would you be willing to go on a date with me?" And so the girl is going to respond to this in two different ways. So first of all, if she wants to go out with the guy, she's gonna say, "Well, nothing important, why?" So that the boy can actually perform the real invitation. And if she's not interested for any kind of reasons, she's gonna say, "Well, I'm going to the movies with my boyfriend." And therefore, the guy will know that she's not interested and that she's actually refusing to be invited somewhere by this guy. But it is pretty obvious that when the boy says, "What are you doing this weekend?" the girl is never going to respond something like, "Well, I'm going to sleep in, then I'm going to eat breakfast." In other words, she is not going to give it a description of her activities on the weekend, but she interprets that as an invitation, and this is what we call a speech act. Now, we need to understand then the difference between form and meaning. So this means that sentences have forms, for example, statements or questions or imperatives, but the utterances are divided according to their communicative functions. So they could be orders or instructions or advice or request, or maybe they can be an invitation or even a prayer. Why not? Let's look at the distinction between form and function. We have here some forms: bake the pie in a slow oven, which is an imperative. We have, do you think you could finish it by tomorrow? This is a question. Come for dinner tomorrow. It's another imperative. It's chilly in here. It's a statement. Then take up his offer is an imperative. We have forgive our trespasses, which is another imperative. We have shut the window, which is another imperative. But now let's look at the functions. If we look at the first one, we can obviously see that this is some kind of instructions like for baking a cake or something. Even though it is imperative, the function is to serve as instructions. In the second case, obviously this question has the function of being a request. When I say, do you think you could finish it by tomorrow, is because I am asking you to have whatever I'm asking you to do by tomorrow, and this is a request. Come for dinner tomorrow is obviously an invitation. It's chilly in here may also be a request, like to close a window or lend a sweater or something like that. Take off his offer is obviously a piece of advice, right? To do something. Forgive us trespasses is part of a prayer that everybody knows, I guess. And then shut the window is an order. We can see here then that different forms can have the same function, or that the same forms may have different communicative functions. Another thing we need to understand is that context is essential to understand pragmatic meaning. For example, if we take the statement, I feel tired, we can see that it could have different meanings according to the context in which it is produced. For example, if a wife says to her husband at night in bed, I feel tired, we can understand that this could mean probably, I don't want to make love. But if this is said by a host to his or her guest late after dinner, I feel tired, this could probably mean something like, it's time for you to leave, I want to sleep, right? If a little boy says, I feel tired, to her mom walking in the street, the little boy probably means something like, please carry me, I'm tired. If a very old and sick person in hospital says this to his family, probably this will mean something like, I'm gonna die, or I'm ready to die. And finally, if an employee says this to his or her boss when asked to do something just before the checkout time, this will probably mean something like, I'll do it tomorrow. So we can see here that the same utterance, I feel tired, could have different meanings according to the context and the person and the interlocutor. It is then pretty obvious that the same form can have different communicative functions. For example, if you have a combination of you plus are plus an adjective, as in you're fired, or you're delicious, or you're stupid, or you're welcome, or even you're wrong, all of these can express like different communicative functions. For example, you're fired could be used to remove somebody from a job or to joke. You're delicious can be used to compliment a person, to flirt with somebody, or even to harass somebody, depending on the context, obviously. You're stupid could be an insult, but it can also be a joke, right? And you're welcome could be used to welcome somebody to a place, or to respond just to somebody thanking you. And you're wrong could be used to disagree. Now let's look at speech acts. Speech acts can be defined as actions performed via utterances and generally called speech acts. So we give them names such as an apology, a compliment, an invitation, a promise, or a request. And obviously in a speech act, the speaker expresses a communicative intention. That's what we call the illocutionary force of the speech act. And obviously the speaker expects this intention to be recognized by the hearer. Now, all of the speech acts are produced in a specific speech event. The speech event is nothing but the circumstances surrounding the utterances, including other utterances. So, in other words, it is the context. The nature of the speech event is going to determine then the interpretation of an utterance as performing a particular speech act. For example, when we say this tea is really cold, the utterance can express different speech acts depending on the speech event where it occurs. If I'm having fun at a beach on a summer day, when I say this tea is really cold, it could be interpreted as an expression of happiness. However, if the same expression is said in a situation where it's cold, it's the winter, and then I say this tea is really cold, it could actually be interpreted as a complaint. Speech acts can be direct or indirect. For example, we have different sentence types such as you wear a seatbelt, or could you wear a seatbelt, or wear a seatbelt. We can see that they can have the same function. For example, the first one, if I tell you, you wear a seatbelt, this could also be a request. If I ask you the question, could you wear a seatbelt, that also has the function of a request. But if I say, wear a seatbelt, this is obviously an imperative, and it is also a request or an order. We can see here then that when there is a direct relationship between the structure and a function, the speech act is called direct. So wear a seatbelt is a direct speech act. But if the relationship is indirect, then the speech act is indirect. So in could you wear a seatbelt, the speech act is indirect. The illocutionary force of a speech act is explained in terms of the performative hypothesis. Now, what is this? According to linguists, underlying every utterance, there is a clause that is implicit that contains a performative verb, which is the one that tells you what the illocutionary force is all about. For example, if we have I hereby, performative verb, you or that you do something, this can be understood as, for example, I hereby order you to stop talking. So when I say stop talking, we understand implicitly that I'm saying to you, I hereby order you to stop talking. So in other words, that there's a performative verb that tells you that that is an order. Some utterances have a specific illocutionary force indicating device or IFID. Now, these are verbs that explicitly name the illocutionary force being performed. We call these performative verbs. Some examples are to warn, to promise, to invite, or to explain. So if I say something, I invite you to my party, you understand that the illocutionary force or the communicative function of that is an invitation because it has the word invite. The same thing happens with all of these verbs. If we go back to the performative hypothesis, we can see that utterances such as clean up this mess, or I hereby order you to clean up that mess, or pragmatic studies meaning in context, or I hereby tell you that pragmatic studies meaning in context, we can see that the first utterance is implicit because I'm telling you clean up this mess, but I don't have the performative verb order. But the second one is explicit because I'm telling you that it's an order. So you can see the direct speech act that I'm performing with the word order. Same thing happens with pragmatic studies meaning in context. This is implicit because I'm just saying something that I consider to be true. But if I say I hereby tell you the pragmatic studies meaning in context, I am telling you, this verb explains that this speech act that I'm carrying out is obviously telling you something. So here the speech act is explicit. A final word about the performative hypothesis is obviously that the two versions of the performatives are not equivalent. For example, sometimes the explicit version becomes strange and therefore it loses its illocutionary force. A final thing is that we do not know for sure how many performative verbs there are in any language. So instead of looking at the performative verbs, we actually need to analyze the illocutionary force of each utterance in terms of the context and the intentions of the speaker. For example, if I say I'll see you later, this could be interpreted as a prediction. If I think that I will probably see you later, it can be interpreted as a promise if something good is going to happen, and then I say I'll see you later because we're going to do something together that is nice to you. Or it could also be a threat in case you don't want to see me and I'm telling you I will see you later. This is interpreted as a threat, and it could also just mean goodbye, right? If I say I'll see you later, this may not mean anything else. I'm just, saying goodbye. But it could also be an order. This means that if I requested you to do something and I'm telling you I'll see you later, this is an order for you so that you can come and see me later. Finally then, we need to understand that the intended elocution efforts will obviously be determined based on the elocution efforts indicating the device, or maybe by the fulfillment of the felicity conditions. In the next video, we'll learn about what the felicity conditions are. So, these are the basics of speech act theory. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'll be seeing you on my next video.